Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. We're very delighted to have you with us here today for this webinar, which is actually focusing on shining a light on deep sea bed mining. We know that deep sea bed mining is being discussed at various international fora, especially now this year, when a lot of these international meetings are resuming again after have been on hold because of the pandemic. So this webinar is actually going to focus on kind of setting the context and looking at what are the kind of various issues. We will then also discuss the IUCN resolution that was passed. So IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, is a union comprised of member state agencies, NGOs, other civil society organizations, as well as indigenous peoples organizations. And at the General Assembly, which is held at the World Conservation Congress every 4th year, the General Assembly votes on various motions, and that is the highest governing body of IUCN and really what dictates our policies. In September in Marseille, various motions were put forward related to the ocean. One that's been very much debated was a motion on a moratorium on deep sea bed mining. This was voted in person in Marseille and with enormous vote and actually in favor of a moratorium. So now that it is IUCN resolution, it's also part of our policy. So we thought it was very interesting to bring together a group of experts that could help shine a light on the issues, but also to provide some more in-depth information from perhaps potentially other states that have not yet put forward a position on deep sea bed mining. So we're hoping that this would actually give us a bit more insight from the panel. So the structure of this webinar is going to be a set of short presentation. We're going to start with Pippa Howard from Fauna Flora International, who will actually do the scene setting in the context. We'll then hear from other experts, Christina Jarder, who is our High Seas advisor for IUCN. We will then move on to listen to Matthew Gianni from Deep Sea Conservation Coalition, followed by his colleague Sean Owen. And last but not least, we'll have Jessica Battle from WWF, who will also kind of contextualize this from a different perspective. So without saying more, we'll launch into these various different presentations. This will then be followed by a 45-minute Q&A or discussion around this topic. So we really look forward to having you engage, but also please feel free to drop your questions, not in the chat, but in the Q&A box. So we will be able to address them as we go forward. We also have the pleasure of having Torsten Thiele with us today from the Global Ocean Trust, who will be moderating the Q&A session after the presentation. So I think it's very timely to have this webinar, as we know that there are a lot of international meetings that are upcoming. Soon the CBD SEPSA will resume in March in Geneva, and also very relevant to deep sea bed mining, but also the BBNJ negotiations in New York also taking place in March. It was also a topic on the UN Ocean, One Ocean Summit that was held in Brest earlier this month. And we also have Our Ocean, which is upcoming, and the UN Ocean Conference. These are all very important meetings, and it's important that we have a discussion around this and see how we can advance the agenda. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Pippa Howard. Please, the floor is yours and feel free to share your screen. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, thank you so much, Minna. So the deep sea is a vast, pristine and largely unexplored area with rich biodiversity and complex biophysical systems that support life on our planet. There are around 230,000 species of marine plants and animals that have been scientifically described, but this represents a small fraction of the number of species that are likely to exist. Even seemingly inhospitable environments have been found to support an array of highly specialized life forms that have evolved to thrive in extreme conditions in the deep sea. While our perceptions of life on Earth are skewed by our daily encounter with photosynthesis, which supports life on land, the deep sea is fundamentally different, and sunlight does not penetrate into the deep oceans. In the deep sea environments, energy for life is generated through chemical reactions, which are used to create the building blocks of life. This productivity fuels life in the oceans, drives its chemical cycles, and lowers atmospheric carbon dioxide. Hotspots for biodiversity in the deep ocean are often associated with deposits of rare minerals, though, and these may be associated with some of the amazing geomorphologies, such as hydrothermal vents and seamounts. Now, movements of currents and migratory animals connect all parts of the ocean, making conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity and ecosystems both complex and dependent on interconnectivity. Marine geosystems are as diverse and dynamic as terrestrial ones, but far more expansive. Changes in ocean systems can have global repercussions because the oceans are connected to one another, and water masses from different seas mix. Most ocean ecosystems have no obvious physical boundaries. Now, deep sea ecosystems are globally important for our fisheries, for genetic evolutionary processes regulating our climate and maintaining ocean chemistry and primary productivity. And in a process that's referred to as the biological pump, ocean biology is responsible for the storage of more carbon away from the atmosphere than on land. Now, complex physical and biochemical processes underline the functioning of this biological pump, balancing ocean chemistry and associated key trace metals fundamental to life. These same trace metals are at the core of deep sea mining. Now, the International Seabed Authority, the ISA, is the international body responsible for managing the seafloor beyond national jurisdiction, and we'll hear a lot more about that just now. But they've granted 31 exploratory deep sea mining contracts. Most of the contracts are held by state-backed companies, including those linked to India, South Korea, the UK, China, Singapore, Poland, Russia, Japan, as well as some small island states. And there are three mining typologies that are being pursued: polymetallic nodules, manganese cobalt crusts, and seafloor massive sulfides, or those associated with hydrothermal vents. These are distributed across the planet as shown in this figure, with most activity taking place in the Western Pacific, in the Clarion-Clipperton zone, but also in the mid-Atlantic and Indian Oceans. Let's take a quick look at each of these typologies. Type 1. So this is the polymetallic ferromanganese nodules from the abyssal plains. Now, though the abyssal plains were once assumed to be vast desert-like environments, research shows that they teem with a wide variety of microbial life and larger creatures. The microbial communities thriving on nodules and on the seafloor are key to the food webs of life on the abyssal plains. New scientific evidence suggests that these microbes on polymetallic nodules fix trace metals onto the nodules, forming these over tens of millions of years. This removal of trace metals from seawater possibly stabilizes ocean chemistry and maintains healthy ocean conditions. So polymetallic nodules are targets for mining in a range of elements such as cobalt, titanium, strontium, copper, nickel, zinc, lithium, aluminium. Now, type 2 is the cobalt manganese crusts from seamounts. Seamount systems are biodiversity hotspots, which host more than 1,300 different species of animals, some of them unique to the seamounts themselves. Seamounts create obstacles that shape ocean currents and direct deep, nutrient-rich waters to the surface. They are fertile habitats for diverse communities of marine life, supporting important fisheries and diverse range of marine megafauna, such as whales and turtles. Now, seamounts are associated with copper-rich ferromanganese crusts, which are seen as potential resources of cobalt, nickel, platinum, and manganese. And thirdly, there's the polymetallic sulfides from hydrothermal vents or seeps and the sulfur massive systems. The deep sea hydrothermal vents and seeps represent one of the most physically, or some of the most physically and chemically diverse biomes on Earth. Globally, the active vent systems are rare habitats comprising, an estimated 50 square kilometers only. And these support high levels of endemism and hold significant ecological importance. They're also really important carbon sinks. These ecosystems have vast genomic repositories. They're a unique pool of potential for provisioning of new biomaterials and medicines and genetic resources. So these hydrothermal vent systems create polymetallic sulfide deposits. And for those who are interested in mining, they are rich in copper and zinc, as well as silver, gold, lead, manganese, and cobalt. Now, we don't yet understand the fundamental biological, geophysical, and biochemical processes of the oceans. And the implications of disruption of these processes requires a really precautionary consideration. Determining the environmental risk and impacts of mineral extraction depends on a lot of knowledge and information and data, and considerable level of knowledge is still needed to be acquired in order to assess and adequately exploit or even think about looking at these. Now, the potential for environmental impacts through deep sea mining were recognized decades ago, but there is growing concern about our ability to define, measure, and mitigate these impacts. And there is evidence for significant and currently immitigable impacts from deep seabed mining on biodiversity. Large-scale habitat removal and associated loss of biodiversity will occur. There are, including systems that underpin the primary production, carbon dioxide and trace metal cycles that I've mentioned. It will disrupt ecological function and behavioral ecology of deep ocean species, smothering fundamental ecological processes over vast and very difficult to predict areas. And the application of the mitigation hierarchy, which calls us to avoid and minimize impacts, is just not applicable in deep ocean systems. So without further ado, and sort of having given you an introduction to this enormous topic, I'm going to introduce you to Christian Jodo, who's with the IUCN Global Marine and Polar Program. Thank you.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be able to join you today to talk about this exciting legal context of the common heritage of mankind. It's a principle that is grounded on principles of solidarity, equity, and stewardship, about the international community coming together to access the supposedly easily retrievable riches of a presumably dead, deep seabed beyond national jurisdiction. So today it is my task to explore the where, the what, and the how of this revolutionary principle encapsulated in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, Part 11, to set the groundwork for understanding how far we are from achieving this vision today. Next slide, please. First, it's important to note, where is the area? The area is more than 60% of the seabed surface of our planet. That was in the light orange. This is what has been deemed to be the common heritage of humankind. Whoops, sorry, I need to adjust something here. That's the light blue that you see, the exclusive economic zones. These were recognized under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea in a way that actually entitled developed countries to continue the freedom of navigation through the waters out to 200 nautical miles. There had been a debate about whether this should be fully territorial under the sovereign rights and jurisdiction of coastal states, but as part of the package deal under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, the freedoms of the high seas were retained. There were also a giveaway in terms of access and ownership of the mineral resources of the extended continental shelf, the area shown in red here. It's mineral as well as oil and gas resources are now allocated to coastal states. But the area marked in light yellow was set aside as the permanent legacy of all humankind, the international seabed area. As the next slide shows, when we talk about the common heritage of mankind under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, it's important to note that the common heritage of mankind includes both the area as well as the resources defined to be the mineral and gaseous resources in the seabed area. So it's not just the minerals themselves, but as the next slide shows, most focus has been on the mineral, only on the mineral resources. But what does the common heritage actually mean? In perhaps the greatest redistribution of global public goods in human history, the Law of the Sea Convention declared that no state may declare sovereignty over the seabed, that rights to the mineral resources belong to humankind as a whole and are to be administered through an international organization, the International Seabed Authority, established for the express purpose of promoting and protecting the interests of humankind as a whole. As we'll see in the next slide, The concept of the benefit of mankind as a whole, how is this to be implemented? Well, there's 4 different ways that the Law of the Sea Convention, including as it was updated and evolved in the 1994 Implementation Agreement, is that particular consideration is to be given to the interests and needs of developing states through an equitable sharing of financial and other economic benefits from activities in the area. This was to be accompanied by capacity development and technology transfer to enable developing countries to fully participate in mining-related activities, including through an envisioned mining arm called the enterprise. Second, that marine scientific research would be promoted, supported, and enabled for all, and that the results would be made available so that they could be used outside the context of the International Seabed Authority. This included specific requirements for training developing countries in marine environmental science. And third, the interests of present and future generations in a healthy ocean were to be protected through requirements for ensuring effective protection of the marine environment from harmful effects which may arise from deep sea mining relating activities. This included the prevention, reduction, and control of pollution and other hazards, of interference with the ecological balance of the marine environment, protection and conservation of other natural resources of the area, and the prevention of damage to the flora and fauna of the marine environment. As the next slide shows, there are many ways that the International Seabed Authority could be, that in many ways, the International Seabed Authority is set up to act as a steward and custodian for humankind as a whole. And for this, it's important to note that there are multiple categories of benefits to be derived from the area. But instead, the focus of some inside the area, as we will hear from Matt Gianni, has been on promoting deep-sea bed mining to the cost of many of these other potential benefits that we're receiving. In addition to the intrinsic value of the areas, these include, of course, the benefits that we currently enjoy from ecosystem services of the deep sea, as Pippa so beautifully depicted, the advances in scientific knowledge that we are gleaning in order to better understand how to manage our ocean in the context of climate change, including rapidly accelerating ocean warming, deoxygenation, as well as ocean acidification. This is knowledge that will be truly of benefit to all humankind, for large parts of the deep sea, in fact, occur in areas within national jurisdiction. We could support other uses and users, including in marine biotechnology, marine biodiscovery, trying to understand how we can take advantage of the marine genetic resources, as we're discussing in New York, as part of the United Nations international legally binding instrument for marine biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. But we could also find better ways to advance the interests of developing states to enable developing nations without the same resources that we in the Western world benefit from, to actually share in the many benefits of a healthy, productive, and resilient ocean. So my key takeaway here is that mineral supply is not the only benefit that we receive from the International Seabed Authority, and that the mandate of the International Seabed Authority needs to be considered and deliberated upon as to where we actually need to go as an international community, how we can actually continue this notion of solidarity, equity, and stewardship for the benefit of all, including future generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. I'm going next, but
thank you very much, Christina. Yes, Matt, please go ahead.
Okay, waiting for Clement to put up the. Okay, thanks. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Mina. I'll talk about issues related to the governance of deep sea bed mining in the international seabed area. First, next slide, please. Just a brief description of the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition. It's a coalition of over 90 organizations worldwide working toward the conservation of deep ocean and open ocean ecosystems. Next slide, please. My talk will focus primarily on the mining for nodules, and in this case, in the Eastern Pacific, because this is where the greatest commercial interest currently lies at the International Seabed Authority. This is mining for nodules in the International Seabed area. But first, just to reemphasize what Pippa Howard presented and some of the comments made by Christina, that scientists are warning that biodiversity loss from deep sea bed mining will be unavoidable, irreversible on human timescales, and offsets in the deep sea are, quote, scientifically meaningless, unquote. And specifically in the Clarion-Clipperton zone, there is concern that the nodules and nodule-dependent animals may take millions of years to recover from the impacts of mining, and even the partial recovery of the animals living in the sediment may take hundreds to thousands of years. This is a quote from a special issue of the Marine Biodiversity, and this is from a editorial piece by Stephanie Kaiser, Craig Smith, and Pedro Abrizo. Next slide, please. Part of that concern, the Clarion-Clipperton zone of the ISA, you can see here on the left side of the screen, the size of the area relative to the continental United States or North America. And on the left, you can see in the coloreds the 17 exploration contracts that have been issued by the International Seabed Authority to date. There are 9 areas that are set aside as no mining areas, but they are areas where mining impacts are permitted to occur, in particular the flow of plumes or sediment plumes on the bottom. Recently, the ISA adopted 4 additional areas, which unfortunately I didn't grab the map on, but there are some additional areas that are no-go areas. But the next slide, please. But the concern in terms of mining the nodules in this area is it partly derives from just the sheer size of the mining operations that would take place. Each mine would cover approximately 10 to 12,000 square kilometers, would strip mine approximately 10 to 12,000 square kilometers of nodules over the course of a 30-year license period to meet the production targets of roughly 3 million tons a year that the ISA has established, or not so much formally established, but with the contractors and the companies concerned are talking about. There would be a 30 to 40,000 kilometer footprint overall of sediment flow along the seabed and in the area just above that as a result of the mining of these 10 to 12,000 square kilometers of nodules. And the sediment distribution, along with wastewater and mining fines discharged back into the water, based on MIT research recently done, could produce plume flows or particulate flows throughout the water column in the Eastern Pacific that could flow up to 1,400 kilometers from the discharge site before finally settling on the bottom. Now, this would be the finer particles. The heavier particles would, of course, fall faster and closer to the discharge areas. And there are concerns over both the seabed life along the bottom, as well as the noise and light and wastewater pollution that could impact fisheries, tuna fisheries in particular in the area, migratory species such as whales, sea turtles, and the biological carbon pump that Pippa referred to in her presentation. Next slide, please. There are a number of studies out in relation to the question of whether deep sea bed mining needs to take place. And the conclusion is that deep sea bed mining in this particular study, for example, and there are others like it, is not needed to transition to renewable energy economies. The metal demands for renewable energy, including the transition to a 100% renewable energy economy by 2050, a most ambitious scenario, can be done without sourcing metals from the deep sea that are used in building renewable technologies, metals such as copper, cobalt, and nickel. And I emphasize with the nodules, it's 4 metals in particular that the seabed mining is interested in: copper, nickel, cobalt, and manganese. Next slide, please. So, in addition to the environmental concerns, there are structural and political concerns regarding the ISA, and this is part of the resolution adopted by the IUCN World Conservation Congress, calling for reform of the ISA. Amongst these concerns are a lack of transparency. The contracts issued by the International Seabed Authority to companies or states to explore are all confidential. They're not publicly available. and meetings of the Legal and Technical Commission, which holds an enormous amount of influence and power over the decision-making in the ISA, are held behind closed doors, and only summary reports of the proceedings of that body are issued each year. Once the mining regulations are adopted by the ISA, it will be very difficult to prevent mining if the Legal and Technical Commission recommends it. The majority of even if the majority of countries are opposed to mining in the international seabed area, it takes at least 2/3 vote of the council and a majority of the members of each of the council groups needed to overturn a recommendation from the LITC. Otherwise, the company or country concerned gets a license. Conflict of interest, ISA will both benefit as a will be both the regulator, but also the beneficiary of the financial returns from issuing licenses. And there's sort of a bureaucratic institutional momentum to mine, and apathy on the part of many governments that are members of the ISA. Only about half of them actually show up at the meetings of the Assembly of the ISA, the supreme body, each year. Next slide, please. Additional concerns are use it or lose it incentives that exist in the 1994 agreement. At some point, it may be that countries will face the prospect of losing their exploration claims if they don't begin exploitation or mining in those claim areas. And those claim areas would revert back to the general pool of claims of seabed areas available to other countries that might want to explore and mine in those areas. A sponsoring state can trigger a 2-year rule, which may see companies or countries get provisional licenses, even if exploitation regulations are not yet adopted, although that's an open question and will be debated this year because Nauru has in fact triggered the 2-year rule with the deadline of July of 2023 for the ISA to make a decision one way or the other on this. And all 167 ISA member countries are guaranteed an equal opportunity to obtain mining licenses for themselves or private companies. And this was a very noble kind of progressive position established as a fundamental or a foundational principle in the Law of the Sea Convention in the 1970s. But fast forward to 2022, and if all countries did apply for a license, or even the majority of countries, it will be very difficult for the ISA to say no. And our view, having participated in meetings of the International Seabed Authority for most of the previous decade as observers, in our view, if the first companies that begin mining prove to be profitable and to pay royalties back into the ISA, it may drive other companies and countries will want to get in on this business, and the economics of this industry may drive its development, with the ISA not being able to exercise significant constraints on runaway mining, a sort of a gold rush to mining. And although equity, as well as is a foundational principle of the international regime for seabed mining, currently 25 of the 31 ISA exploration contracts are in the hands of 7 countries: China, France, Germany, India, Japan, Korea, and Russia, and 3 companies: UK Seabed Resources, GSR, Global Sea Minerals Resources in Belgium, and the Metals Company, or Deep Green, as some of them know, partnered with Allseas, which is a Canadian-Swiss company. So if the benefits of deep sea bed mining are to be shared equitably, the question is, with this concentration of the claims currently in the hands of such a small group of countries and companies, one has to ask, what is the benefit to humankind as a whole? Who actually will benefit from the mining that may well take place within the next year or two, unless the ISA agrees to a moratorium? Next slide, please. Just to point out that in our view, the mining the deep sea, given the science and the scientific concerns that have been expressed to date, is incompatible with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and in particular SDG Target 14.2, which commits states to sustainably manage and protect marine and coastal ecosystems to avoid significant adverse impacts, including by strengthening their resilience, and take action for their restoration. And the opposite will occur if deep sea mining takes place. So to wrap up, next slide, please. Just to mention that, in fact, we're not the only ones saying this. The UK House of Commons Environment Audit Committee released a report in 2019 that concluded that deep sea mining would have catastrophic impacts on the seafloor where it occurs. The International Seabed Authority, benefiting from revenues from issuing mining licenses, is a clear conflict of interest, and the case for deep sea bed mining has not yet been made. Next slide, please. Again, the European Union has called for a moratorium. Next slide, please. And there is growing support for a moratorium from a variety of people, which individuals, legislatures, etc., which my colleague Sean Owen will discuss. And final slide, I do believe, coming up. So, a moratorium on deep sea bed mining is legally defensible, required under the precautionary approach, and consistent with contemporary commitments to protecting biodiversity. We're calling for reform of the ISA to promote and conduct marine scientific research to better understand the role of the deep sea and open ocean ecosystems to planetary climate processes, to the regulation of planetary climate processes, and major decisions will be taken by the ISA in the next 1 to 2 years. Regulations, allowing mining, or pausing the process. And ISA country positions are now far apart. CBD COP15 can really help shape the debate at the ISA. So next slide, and final slide. So thank you, and just a few links to deep sea bed mining articles in the news. And please allow me to hand over to my colleague Sean Owen from the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt, and hello and welcome everyone. The world that we live in feels smaller every day. I think we're more aware than ever before of how much the decisions that have been made in the past are influencing the world, the life that we experience today, and equally the decisions that are made in other parts of the world, how they impact our lives, and how the decisions that we make today will be impacting the lives of future generations. So this decision at this moment in time to open up a vast new extractive frontier to mining of the deep seabed, as Pippa and Christina and Matt have outlined, with all of the risks and threats that are associated, it becomes critical that this also has social license, that there is a social component to these decisions. So I'm going to cede the first minute or two of my speaking moment to the Reverend James Bagwan from the Pacific Council of Churches.
And greetings from Suva, Fiji, where the Pacific Conference of Churches Secretariat is based, along with many other regional civil society organizations. It is my honor and my task today to share a Pacific collective position on deep sea mining. That is, it is not needed, it is not wanted, and it is not consented. As Pacific Island people, we acknowledge that the ocean is the living blue heart of our planet. It is our common heritage, but also our common responsibility. We are its guardians. We recognize its significance and its essence as the basis of our Pacific identity and well-being. We are the ocean. In its preservation, we are preserved. For millennia, our ancestors have held this mantle of stewardship, embedding the wisdom of their resource management and conservation practices into their culture and traditions. Their vision was always beyond their temporal needs. The survival and well-being of future generations was central to their view of the world. So as custodians of the responsibility to protect the ocean against exploitation and destruction in our time, we as Pacific Islanders have a sacred and long-standing legacy to uphold. Our forebears have on this frontier stood firm against the ruinous incursions of nuclear testing, of drift net fishing and bottom trawling, and marine pollution. And against impossible odds, they united to move a world to adopt a nuclear ban treaty, a ban on drift net fishing, and the London Dumping Convention. Awareness of the connection between climate change and the health of our oceans gathers momentum globally. Deep sea mining is the latest in a long list of destructive industries to be thrust into our sacred ocean.
So that was a film that was recorded about a year and a half ago for the Pacific Island Nature Conference. And it picks up on, it was the launch of the Pacific Blue Line Collective, which is calling for a ban on deep sea bed mining. And the collective represents church groups, women's groups, indigenous groups, community groups across the Pacific region. If we could go to the second slide, please. And so it picks up on a number of key themes that are important to this question of whether this new industry has the social license to proceed. It picks up on the question of our common heritage, which we heard about from Christina. It picks up on this concept of rights and responsibilities that we share for this common resource, including for the decisions that we make to future generations. If you could move into presentation mode, please, that would be great. Thank you. So another beautiful quote from another Indigenous leader in the Pacific region: seabed is our Mother Earth, and if she is disrupted, so too is the ocean, and as are we. And this is a common theme that we hear again and again, shared across ocean peoples, coastal peoples, as we speak about this industry, which is only just starting to come into the public sense. Next slide, please. So as Matt mentioned, political processes, political voices, scientific processes and voices, the chorus of voices calling for a moratorium, a pause, is growing. So this is a quote from the UK House of Commons Environmental Audit Committee a few years ago now, saying that the case for deep sea bed mining has not yet been made. Next slide. More recently, as we've heard at the IUCN Congress in Marseille last year, 95%, 577 of the civil society groups, members of IUCN, voted for a moratorium, pressing pause on opening this industry. Next slide, please. Similarly, we have over 600 marine scientists and marine policy experts from over 44 countries who have now signed a statement calling for a pause on deep sea bed mining, based on all of the evidence that Pippa and Christina and Matt have laid out. We just don't know enough, and what we know gives us cause for concern. Next slide, please. Sir David himself has said that the rush to mine this pristine and unexplored environment risks creating irreversible impacts. Next slide, please. And what we've heard from, oh, we're missing a picture. What we've heard from the Reverend as well is a reminder that social resistance has succeeded in stopping other dangerous activities or other activities that have already caused damage, whether it's nuclear testing or destructive fishing, lead and petrol ocean dumping. We've had a more recent win in the Arctic where oil exploration has now been banned. And so, and if we can, next slide, please. And similarly, on the more positive side, we've had social movements, come together to preserve and protect the Antarctic for the common good, for the global good of peace and science. And this opens the question as to whether we're at a point in history where we can recognize the value of the deep ocean and look to it as another wilderness that we value both intrinsically, culturally, as well for science and the ecosystem services that it provides. Is there a way that we can take a similar approach to the deep ocean? Next slide, please. So Her Deepness, Dr. Sylvia Earle, is also calling for a moratorium. Join us in saying no to deep sea bed mining. As the Reverend himself said, we don't need it, we don't want it. What we do need is a healthy ocean. Next slide, please. And I leave you with a question. What have we learned from the failings of our extractive approach to managing our common heritage, our natural capital, our sacred legacy for human and planetary survival? We recognize, as we're calling for a moratorium or a pause, we recognize that there are challenges that we face in our world like never before. We face a massive biodiversity loss. We face challenges to global health, the pandemic, and of course we face climate change impacts. But we say there are alternatives. And I'm going to hand over to Jessica Battle to talk about some of the alternatives. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. I hope you can hear me okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what business say and what some of the alternatives might be to deep-sea bed mining. Next slide, please. So this growing demand that we hear about minerals and metals being needed for a linear development of how we consume and produce. It doesn't have to cost the earth. It doesn't have to cost the ocean. There are alternative solutions. And we believe that a combination of innovation and recycling and repair can satisfy industry's needs for raw materials without opening the seafloor to mining. And we also believe that it doesn't have to be a choice. We do not have to sacrifice the deep ocean to begin in earnest on the necessary journey to a more sustainable future. And as Matt and Sean have said before me, we do need a global moratorium on all deep-sea mining activities, as was also stated in the IUCN Resolution 122. All alternatives to deep-sea bed mining minerals need to be explored before, if at all, a moratorium can be lifted. And then we would need, of course, appropriate regulation to protect the marine environment and human well-being, should it be deemed to be a responsible thing to do. But these calls for a moratorium are increasing, as we've heard, and now also big brands, the very companies that the proponents of seabed mining are saying there would be consumers of minerals from the deep, are saying no thanks, and they're joining this call for a moratorium. As one of these purported customer groups for deep sea mining minerals is the EV, the electrical vehicle industry, it is striking to see that major battery manufacturers and car brands do not see that these minerals will be needed in their products already today. So way before seabed mining is starting. And these companies include, as you see on this slide, Samsung SDI is a huge battery provider for many electrical vehicle companies. BMW Group, Volvo Group, Volkswagen Group, Scania, and now the startup Rivian, which is backed by Amazon and Ford in the US, and the huge French Renault Group have also joined these calls for a moratorium. And this is what they say. I think you can take the next slide. We support a moratorium on deep sea mining as a matter of precaution and commit not to source minerals from the deep seabed, to exclude such minerals from our supply chains, and not to finance deep seabed mining activities. And also other businesses, such as the emerging Scandinavian giant battery manufacturer Northvolt, and also Microsoft, have stated that they're not interested in minerals from the ocean at all. And this group of companies is growing. So why is there a rush when the demand is not there? I think that one reason is because the proponents of deep sea mining are relying on an old, outdated linear resource use model. And this will not help us to get us to net zero and reversing the loss of biodiversity, the two interlinked crises that we are facing as humanity today. They are, on the other hand, in a hurry to get return on their investments before the tide turns. And the tide is turning, as we have heard from previous speakers. Technology is often being touted as a solution to many of the problems posed by our way of running the economy, the constant growth paradigm. And technology can indeed help us here. Investors need to put their money to find solutions that make our economy less reliant on new sources of raw materials. And I think it is one of the proofs of this is that the strategies of the companies having called for a moratorium do not include seabed mining minerals in their strategies at all. It's often said that regulators lag behind business and research. And I think what is interesting this time is that regulators can do one smart thing to catch up. They can do what we and others propose. They can ensure that a moratorium decision be taken by governments at the ISA. Next slide, please. To ensure that technological advances and independent science are being deployed to their fullest potential, and thus avoiding opening up another extractive frontier.
and instead really and properly setting the world on the path towards a nature positive future. It is the only responsible way. I think I'm going to stop there. I could say more, but I think it's more interesting to have a discussion and to listen to questions. I do think I have another slide, but just please click through them and we'll get to the next part. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Jessica, and all the presenters here today. I think those who are listening, obviously, I feel like you have been enlightened. You've had Pippa setting the environmental context and really going through that deep sea mineral typology, as well as really emphasizing the uniqueness and the intrinsic values of deep sea habitats. Christina then shed a light on the kind of the legal context, and also putting a lot of emphasis on equity, as well as ISA's role. Matt Gianni then basically looked at the whole kind of governance structure surrounding this, and also talked about not just moving from the environmental, but also the structural and political concerns that has been raised, and also in looking at ISA in terms of the lack of transparency. So very kind of strong arguments there. We then had actually very timely looking at the social, basically hearing from Sean that the case has not been made yet. And, you know, this does cause a reversible impact, and, you know, also demonstrating that social resistance in the past, there are precedent that it can actually have a positive outcome. And I think the recent voting on the resolution in Marseille was basically a testament to, you know, civil society organization actually saying, no, we don't want this. And I think that was actually also the nice quote from Sylvia in terms of, well, we don't need it, we don't want it. I think that was a perfect segue over to Jessica, who then basically emphasized that this doesn't have to cost the earth, and there are alternatives. And we saw some kind of concrete examples of the business sector commitment, whether it's a battery manufacturer or a different brand. And, you know, some of the kind of potential rationale for rushing this, and in terms of, you know, we are based on kind of linear model, and Jessica brought in the principles of, you know, the sustainable blue economy, and obviously circular economy. It's a big part of that. So I think that was, you know, really interesting to see those examples of powerful commitments and basically how we can move forward. So some concrete solutions there. So thank you very much. I think that was an excellent kind of scene starter for our discussion that we're going to have. We've got a couple of questions in the chat so far. We do encourage to put some more questions in there. And then feel free to, you can also ask the questions of, you know, how some of these questions have been answered. Of course, we will have this session moderated by Torsten Thielen, who's also joining us now. So I think without further ado, I will hand it over to Torsten to kind of dig a little bit deeper in some of these kind of concerns, and also looking forward to this year ahead. What does it mean, deep sea bed mining in the context of these international meetings, and certainly the BBNJ and the Substa and CBD. So Torsten Thielen from Global Ocean Trust, please, I'll hand over the floor to you to moderate this Q&A, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Minna, and thanks again to all these excellent panelists and making it very clear where we stand in this process. I think we can kick off with a great question that comes from Bobby Jodobush, which aims at saying, Christina Gjörde raised the need to really reconsider and deliberate what the ISA mandate is. So go beyond the very specific draft regs discussion and move to the level of what is the ISA all about, and how do we have avenues to actually discuss that role. So maybe I go back to Christina first to tell us what would be the way to actually engage in that broader discussion around the future role of the ISA. Christina, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. And then I will say a few words and then allow others to speak up. I think this discussion was kickstarted at the IUCN World Conservation Congress, where there were action cafes that enabled people to actively deliberate and ask questions. In Brest, my colleagues with IUCN actually hosted an informal debate about deep sea bed mining. I think we need to continue these discussions globally, individually. The upcoming CBD meetings, the SBSTA, as well as the discussions on the Global Biodiversity Framework are a critical place to take this to the heart of biological diversity. Also, we have the United Nations General Assembly, which is charged in many ways with overseeing the implementation of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, as well as the discussion with the negotiators at the UN deliberations towards this new convention on the conservation, sustainable use of marine biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. There are multiple avenues for taking this forward, and I'll allow Matt to get into some of the more specifics with respect to the CBD. Thank you.
Thanks, Christina. Yeah, well, you have to recognize that the International Seabed Authority is an autonomous global body. And so it has to be the one to actually take the decision to put the halt to the movement toward deep sea bed mining. That will actually be the subject of a debate, an intensive debate this year going on into the first half of 2023, because of the fact that Nauru has triggered a so-called 2-year rule on behalf of the Canadian company, the metals company. So where the CBD, the UN General Assembly, the BBNJ negotiations, and other processes that Christina referred to can help prompt and shape that discussion will be through expressing clear concern over why the rush to go in and start opening up this whole new frontier of the planet that has remained largely untouched before, that is the common heritage of humankind, the global commons, for the benefit of a handful of companies and countries that want to start mining there to the detriment to most of the rest of us. So, you know, it's a kind of a lateral pressure on the ISA, but ultimately it's the governments that are members of the International Seabed Authority, and in particularly the 36 countries that sit on the Council of the ISA that have the power to make a decision to put a pause or a halt, establish a moratorium. And those are the countries that really need to be engaged on this.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you, Christina. And maybe I jump right on then to the most recent question we got, which is really about what can people do to support deep sea protection, to stop deep seabed mining. And maybe Sean and Jessica can start thinking about that. Sean, would you like to go first?
Sure. Thank you, Torsten. It's a great question and a really important one that we're getting more and more, which is a nice sign that the topic is really landing more in the public psyche, which is so important. So first, inform yourselves. Absolutely learn about what the risks are, how important the ocean is, and the connectedness between the ocean and the rest of planetary health between all of us. We, as Matt and others have noted, we have decisions to make as consumers in terms of how much we consume and where we source the products from. So the list that Jessica presented of the companies, the growing list of companies that are committing not to source minerals from the deep seabed is important. And the whole circular economy question comes in here. So it's reduction, it's recycling, it's reuse, it's the whole story of how we change, how we transition our economic choices that we make. And then talk about it would be my other recommendation, is bring it into the schools, talk about it with your children, with your friends, because every time that we share with anyone the plan, the thoughts to go down into the deep, to open this vast new frontier in this wilderness, people react with shock and horror. People can't believe that this is actually something that in this day and age we're proposing to do. So talk about it and build that sense of outrage. Jessica, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. It's good. It's a really, really good question, and I don't think I had that much more to add, except that Matt was saying that only about half of the states who are members of the International Seabed Authority actually attend the meetings. And many of the states who are not attending the meetings are states that are dependent upon ocean health. Some of them obviously would have budgetary difficulties there's a lot of meetings in Jamaica where the International Seabed Authority is happening, so they might have budgetary problems, but there are actually quite a bunch of rich countries in Europe and in other places who do not prioritize the International Seabed Authority at the same time as they have made great commitments in many conferences and towards SDG 14 to protect and conserve the marine environment. And so I think there is also an opportunity, if you can, to raise this issue, to talk about it and then raise the concern about seabed mining with your politicians. It needs to be a political decision. It's really important.
Thank you, Jessica. And I'll have Pippa to follow on that point as well.
Well, thanks. I would have just repeated, I think, that we do need to raise this with our politicians. We need to make it a very present issue. We need to, see it more in the press as general, just a lack of knowledge about, the threat. And actually, it's quite an immediate threat too, because things are running away without us. There is a lot of effort, and it's great to see that the social mandate has not been given. When you look at the results that Sean was telling us that came through from the IUCN Congress, people don't want it. Those who know about it don't want it. So what? Those who don't know about it have no opinion right now. So it's about voting for those who do in your own sort of local parliamentary processes, but just bringing it to the fore. And also, consumer choices.
Thank you. But following on, we have a really interesting question from a researcher in Finland around, well, are the mechanisms that are already considered like marine protected areas that should be part of the instruments in high seas and deep sea governance, what role can they play in terms of providing some protections? Is that an effective part, or is that actually not helping sufficiently? Who would like to get in on that one? Jessica, I see your hand up.
I'll just start that marine protected areas are tools to conserve the marine environment from a threat. That's why you have marine protected areas. But the threat from seabed mining, as far as we know it, and the more we know about the deep sea, the threat from potential seabed mining is so large that we would like it not to go forward at all. So marine protected areas is something you use if you have a threat. We have something here we can actually prevent from starting. Thank you.
Great. Do we have somebody else? Christina, I see your hand up.
Just to go forward, the concept of marine protected areas is absolutely vital in this rapidly changing ocean. But we have to remember the other side of the commitment is to 100% sustainability. And activities like deep seabed mining, where there are really deep concerns about the potentially permanent, widespread and extensive harm that could be caused both to the seafloor and in the water column, is something that small boundaries for marine protected areas cannot keep out. We're talking about ocean degradation as a major problem here. And a marine protected area is, as my colleague Dan Laffoley would like to say, it's an island in the sea of destruction. So we need to really think more deeply about the purported solutions to these sorts of problems.
Great, thank you. Now we have another question, and again, Jessica, this links to the slide you showed of companies who have already thought this through and made a clear decision. Moratorium, we're not going to get involved in any of this. Now, the questioner raised an interesting point. What would happen in their minds and the minds of these more enlightened companies if the ISA was allowed to go ahead and provide approvals or have a regulatory framework in place that is able then to hand out deep sea mining licenses? Would they change their mind? How would they go about it? How do you see that interaction going between the business world and any efforts of the ISA to put itself onto an exploitation regime?
Yeah, no, that's also a very good question. The businesses who are saying no to seabed mining are saying no to seabed mining, regardless of whether the ISA is thinking, is issuing licenses, because they're doing it from a precautionary point of view. They're doing it until all alternatives have been explored, and it can be proven that seabed mining can cause no major harm to the marine environment. So it actually doesn't have anything to do with the ISA.
Thank you so much. Now, as you all know, the Convention on Biological Diversity is having important meetings in the coming weeks. And so the question arises, how are these two aspects linked? How can one use the CBD meetings to actually point a light on this? Is that something you're thinking about, you're engaging in? What would be your suggestions? Who would like to come in on that topic? Matt, I see your hand up.
The hand seems to be disappearing into the background here, so I'm glad you caught that. Now, the CBD, I mean, this is the Convention on Biological Diversity. This is the treaty organization that is designed to further advance biodiversity conservation and protection. The contracting parties to this organization really have a legal responsibility and a moral obligation to be the voice of biodiversity conservation, which has gotten, as we know, all the more urgent given reports from the International Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which has warned that 1 million species are at risk of extinction, many within the next several decades. And so I think from my point of view and our point of view, the biodiversity, the COP15, the Convention on the Conference of Parties needs to send a clear signal that if the scientists are saying biodiversity loss would be widespread and permanent, then their counterparts representing those same countries at the ISA should say we cannot begin deep sea bed mining. And that's what the scientists are saying. And if the Convention on Biological Diversity doesn't stand up and step up to this, we'll have a major gap, as it were, I think, in terms of moving forward on international political commitments. For example, in the leaders' pledge to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030, and those sorts of political commitments and recognitions of the fact that I think, as Jessica said, we can't and shouldn't be solving the climate crisis by creating an even worse biodiversity crisis. We need to solve both of those at the same time. And the CBD really is the venue for governments to make that assertion very, very clear.
Thank you very much. And Christina's hand is up as well. Christina.
Sure. I just put in the chat the Article 4 of the Convention on Biological Diversity, which sets forth the jurisdictional scope of the CBD. And it talks about, in the cases of components of biological diversity, the genetic resources, it applies in areas within the limits of national jurisdiction. But with respect to processes and activities, it applies both within and beyond national jurisdiction. And these are processes and activities under national jurisdiction and control. So the Convention on Biological Diversity, where it doesn't regulate activities, it can actually is in a strong position to create that moral call on its states parties, its members, to actually say no to deep seabed mining. That was its, as it strives to reverse the loss of biological diversity, as it strives to integrate biological diversity into sectoral management. It's an opportunity that Matt and I were both engaged in, and Sean, in the opportunity when the Convention on Biological Diversity Conference of Parties expressed its concerns about bottom trawling on the high seas using bottom contact gear. I think Matt can elaborate on this further, but there was an opportunity when the states parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity realized what was happening in this increasingly expansive industry that was not regulated at the time, that it called on states and stateless parties to actually not move to regulate deep sea bottom fishing in a way that would avoid significant adverse impacts. It helped to set the stage for future activities at the United Nations General Assembly, as well as within the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, to develop technical guidelines, and then working with the RFMOs to implement that. Matt, would you like to elaborate here?
I think you covered it pretty well, Christina, but it was the 2004 meeting of the convention, Conference of Parties, COP7, that responded to a call from the UN General Assembly asking the CBD and other international bodies to consider urgently the risks to deep water ecosystems, such as seamounts, cold water corals, and so forth, similar to the types of ecosystems that would be threatened by deep sea bed mining. And in 2004, the CBD said there's a real threat here, and the United Nations General Assembly should do something about it. And the language adopted by COP7 in 2004 ultimately made it into the first of the United Nations General Assembly resolutions that committed states to take urgent action to protect so-called vulnerable marine ecosystems from the destructive impact of deep sea bottom trawling. So it is possible for the CBD to send a similar signal on deep sea bed mining, calling for a moratorium, urging states, participants at meetings of the ISA, including those many that don't show up, but that are members of the ISA, to take that moratorium and call into the ISA negotiations and get a clear decision from the International Seabed Authority to put a pause or a halt on this march toward deep sea bed mining, and until we have far more information on what the impacts are, and can make informed decisions as to whether this can be managed without doing harm to the marine environment.
Great. And there's actually a very specific question in this context. So assume you're an adjacent state. You are near one of these areas, and you're really concerned. We heard from you, the plumes can travel far and vast. Is the environmental impact assessment process one of the ways you can actually voice your concerns? How is that set up? Do we have robust ideas around the assessment of individual potential contractual licenses?
I can put my hand up for that one too, but I defer to somebody else.
Well, go first and I'll cut you off when we see the next hand.
Right now, as we speak, the environmental impact assessments that have been done, submitted to the International Seabed Authority by India, by the company Global Sea Mineral Resources, by the metals company, that are all testing mining equipment out in their claim areas, have been woefully inadequately, in large part because they simply don't have much information on the species and the ecosystems that exist out there. And so we're getting environmental impact assessments that are being approved in effect by the ISA, insofar as the ISA says, yeah, sure, go ahead and go testing, where there is no way to determine what the impact of that testing would be, or those activities would be, because they simply don't know enough about these ecosystems that are being impacted to make any sorts of determinations, even on the short time frames in which those tests occur, much less over longer timescales that would occur on 24/7 mining, 300 days a year, and so forth. But the impacts, I mean, scientists are clear, these impacts are going to be far-reaching. There are likely to be transboundary impacts, sediment flows going into national waters from mining in international waters. There are likely to be indirect impacts. Species that migrate through the areas where the mining would occur also migrate into countries' waters. Take tuna, for example, take whales, take sharks migrating across the Pacific. They will migrate through the area of the Clarion-Clipperton Zone into EEZs in North America, Central America, North Asia, etc. So there are the impacts there. And of course, there are the impacts that scientists are highlighting are likely to occur to all of us, meaning which would come from interfering with the biological carbon pump that Pippa mentioned, where you have organisms in the water column who draw down carbon from the upper layers of the world's oceans and bring it through a biological process down into the deep sea. And if those organisms are affected by light, by noise, by sediments clogging their feeding apparatuses and so forth, that in turn diminishes the capacity of the oceans to draw down that carbon out of the atmosphere.
Thanks, Matt. And we will have a final little segment of discussion around the details of the IUCN resolution. So I'll ask Pippa and Christina to get ready to get into the meat of that. But before we do that, we've had another question about the ISA's practice. So a question about, well, did exploration give us at least something around science, or is it all in the direction of getting something out of minerals? Did the capacity building that was involved, i.e. engaging scientists into that process, what are these additional benefits, and how can we keep them or build on them or expand them in a world of a moratorium? So maybe who would like to make a comment on those aspects? Pippa, I see your hand.
Yeah, thanks, Thorsten. I think, first comment really is that we need independent scientific endeavor. And, one of the risks really is that the independence of that scientific inquiry that is alongside exploration is compromised. And that's not to say anything about the scientists involved, of course, because, it's very difficult to get into those waters, very expensive to run those sorts of research programs. And they do need to be run over decades, actually, because as Mac pointed out, the environmental impact assessment process is entirely inadequate because it's only essentially drawing off sparse data over short periods of time, and also inconsistent data and data that is not necessarily being captured in a way that can be repeated over robust monitoring and evaluation processes. So I think, exploration needs to be done in its own entire, and very transparent and inclusive way, and certainly consultative, and there's a lot of strengthening needed around what those approaches are. But I think we need to see a lot more investment from independent nation states as much as anyone else into just understanding and answering all those questions that I put forward when I was trying to lay out the very complex biological and biochemical and geobiochemical systems that are essentially holding the health of our oceans and our climate at stake. So that's just my initial thought.
No, thank you. And I think on the capacity building aspect of it, on the engagement of scientists from developing countries, what's your, is it a similar line of thought? We should do that more fundamentally in a more focused way, in a more inclusive way, or what are the thoughts around that? Jessica, or who would like to come in on that?
I can come in on that, but it sounded like people wanted to say something.
Oh, sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you.
No, I was just going to say that I think there is a similar sort of question there. Who's funding those research and the capacity building is, as we've seen at the moment, a lot of it's coming from those with very vested interests in progressing the whole deep sea mining agenda. Again, building capacity is one thing, but actually having it to line your own pockets is another.
Yeah, and I think I'd follow up on that one, because I think that what is very, very important, and this is also something that's discussed in the BBNJ context, whose capacity building, by whom and for what, and the capacity building needs should be coming from those who are actually the subjects of capacity building. It shouldn't be identified by somebody else, and then there needs to be a transparency on how, in terms of the research that is being done, how this data is shared as well, and also where the funding comes from. But the fundamental thing is, I think, that research and capacity building has to be done fundamentally to answer the questions that need to be answered. And those questions at this point are not questions around whether we should go mining. It's about what does the environment look like, irrespective of the interest of going mining. And there are institutions who are doing this already. The Schmidt Ocean Institute, for example, provides space on its ships for researchers, and that funding is independent of any industrial extractive interest. as an example. And there was also an answer on the questions in the chat or in the Q&A boxes around the same thing, where investments from multilateral banks and others really need to go into this capacity building, which is not linked to extraction. And that is one way of trying to, to helping to fulfill the SDGs in a totally different way than a targeted funding that is aiming towards extraction at the end of the day.
Thank you very much. And I see Christina.
Sure. I just like to echo what my colleagues have said, but also to raise the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development that provides the potential framework for a more globally collaborative endeavor to actually try to explore and understand the secrets of the deep sea. We know there are many vital interrelationships between the deep sea bed and the water column above, as we are trying to protect these critical linkages in our ocean planet. We need to understand what are the critical nodes, what are the critical functions, and what are the critical impacts of climate change on these elements before we really start to try to introduce new stressors onto the marine environment. The Decade of Ocean Science is about co-creation of science to answer the questions that we need to address and to find the ocean we want in 20 to 30 years, or even 10-year time. So it does provide an opportunity for states and for institutions to come together to co-design programs, as Deep Ocean Stewardship has already done on the Challenger 150, to actually start trying to answer some of these fundamental questions. But I would just close with saying it's woefully underfunded. And if we do want to start bringing in global scale capacity to address global scale as well as national needs to better understand and manage our ocean, we do need to step up our responsibilities for helping others. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And I think there was a related question actually to fisheries who would be affected and what their position is on the moratorium. Does anybody want to directly answer that? I think Jesse is also answering in the chat, but I see Sean's hand up.
Yes, thank you, Torsten. We have on record a number of fisheries associations who have expressed deep concern about the opening of the deep seabed to mining. A number of the European fisheries associations, the Long Distance Advisory Committee, have come out with formal statements calling for a moratorium. So the more that the tuna pull and line fisheries, so we can share actually in the chat box a link to the page where we record all of this. We have a number of fisheries associations, and the more that they hear about this, the more inclined the fisheries industry is to join the call for the moratorium.
Thank you so much. And I think that's probably the time when we move to just a final focus on Resolution 122. So maybe start off with Pippa. Why is this resolution so critical, and what can we best do to promote it as we move forward?
Well, thanks, Torsten. Well, resolution is what's evolved from the motion 69. It's resolution 122, and essentially this is a call to action from all of those who have been signatories to the voting in the IUCN World Conservation Assembly. So it's really now saying, well, this is what is now becoming IUCN policies, and we want all members to start to enact and start to act on delivering the sort of basic principles which were outlined in the call. So really, I mean, FFI was one of the sponsors. We had a number of co-sponsors, and each of us is needing to put in effort, resources, and certainly some level of commitment into progressing this agenda. And that means, partly around doing, engaging with our various stakeholders, but also, practicing this in the work that we do around impact and influence across our global operations. I'm going to ask Christina, if she can add to that, being well embedded in IUCN.
Christina,
well,
over to
thanks.
you.
I'd just like to highlight, that the IUCN resolution really revolves around 4 or actually 5 different elements. One is the rigorous and transparent impact assessments, so that we actually understand what the risks are to the environment, to cultural, to economies of developing states who actually depend on mineral extraction, where we also need to be addressing the cleanup of that. But we need to be able to understand these impacts, operations, and ensure that effective protection can be guaranteed. We need to make sure that precautionary principle, ecosystem approach, and polluter pays principles are fully incorporated and integrated into any regulatory regime. But at the same time, we also need to be looking outside the seabed to ensure that policies for responsible production and use of metals are actually in place. How can we accelerate the transition to a truly circular economy and responsible terrestrial mining practices? And then the other element is about public consultation and ensuring that there's effective engagement, that there's free, prior, informed consent of indigenous peoples, and consent from potentially affected communities. And then finally, it's all about how is the International Seabed Authority being governed? And these were the concerns I tried to raise at the beginning about this organization that has been established to be operating on the best interests of all humankind. There are some significant concerns that Matt raised about certain parts of the International Seabed Authority that are pushing too far and too fast. So the final element of the IUCN resolution is about promoting the reform of the International Seabed Authority to ensure that all elements are transparent, accountable, inclusive, effective, and enable environmentally responsible decision-making and regulation. Back over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. I think that was excellent. And I see Matt's hand coming up.
Yeah.
Matt.
Just to add,
to add on that summary.
Yeah, just to one thing. No, the summary is perfect. It's very good. Thank you, Christina. Good. But just to mention that, you know, the resolution is increasingly being picked up by legislatures and governments. So, for example, and I think that's testimony to the way the resolution really lays out the concerns and calls for and the actions that it calls for in response to those concerns. So, the Chilean Senate, for example, unanimously adopted a resolution modeled on the IUCN resolution. Calling for a moratorium. The regional governments of the Canary Islands and the province of Galicia in Spain also adopted resolutions similar, using the language of the IUCN resolution, as did the legislature in the territory of Guam in the Pacific. So I think we'll see more of that. And again, this is all the more reason why it would be very helpful to carry this resolution into the CBD negotiations and say, can the CBD not endorse this resolution and make this call on the ISA as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. And I think if anybody hasn't yet looked at the Q&As, there have been some specific answers also provided to the more detailed questions. Obviously, this is a broad effort at shining a light on deep seabed mining. There are all these details to be discussed about all the different parties. So we had a specific question of what's the role of multilateral development banks as one of the potential players, one of the potential funders. We had a discussion around exploration and definitions relative to exploitation and the way these terms are being used in the context of the ISA, so clarity around that. We obviously have a discussion as to what is deep seabed mining in the international areas beyond national jurisdiction versus discussions in deep sea mining activities in national waters, in exclusive economic zones. And we had this discussion around marine protected areas and the way these terms are being used in the context of an ISA regime with these APIs versus in the discussion of potentially the new BBNJ agreement or in a national context. So on all of these areas, I suggest anybody who looks further, have a look at these question and answers that we already have. We also have a discussion around, what we talked about was very much focused on the manganese nodules as the first area in which we are being presented with potential draft regulations. But of course, there are also discussions around seamount cobalt crusts. Again, lots of additional detail, but I think what this discussion has really helped us show is that with the resolution, with a call for a moratorium, with a backing from a whole range of partners, we now have a clear, robust agenda, which we need to take into the different fora, engage with the different parties. I thought it was really great to have these early questions from the audience about what can I do? What can my sector do? What can I do as a person? What can I do as a company? What can I do as a country that is directly affected or that is sitting on the fence, that needs to learn more, know more, get engaged more? So I will have a final look around if there are any urgent hand up there, and then I will ask Minna to do the final closing. I see Jessica's hand. Is that right? No, Jessica's fine. Anybody else who needs to come in at this stage? Otherwise, I will.
I actually do like to come in. I just
want
want
you
to,
do?
Yeah,
Well,
I
there
do,
you are
if you
then.
don't mind. I just want to really, I'm not going to reiterate it, but I would like our audience to think about the reverence words, because I think they are so important in this context. And they should really be part of what should be guiding us and the international community when we think about how to organize ourselves into the future. Thank you.
Great. And anybody else who has this type of final takeaway message? What do you want people to go away with from this important 90 minutes? If they had one thing that they need to tell their friends and move on with.
I'll say something. I think for me that what always strikes me is the magnitude of this. That the ocean is a very large, it's the blue lung as was heard earlier, and that we can never find an isolated deep sea mine that can be contained and can be isolated from what else is going on in the ocean. So the complexity of our ocean systems and the extraordinary vulnerability of our ocean ecosystem has to be taken into account first and foremost. And we cannot progress an industry like this without causing serious harm. And that's just something that is de facto fact.
Yeah, thank you. And actually we have a call for action in the chat. People can call on companies to keep the deep sea mining products out of their products. So that's a call from Defend the Deep. Sean, your final call to action, and then Christina.
My final words, not necessarily call to action, but my final words that I would like people to leave with is that there is no such thing as sustainable deep sea mining. No such thing. And so, yeah, I'll leave it there.
Very clear. Christina.
I would just say that we have an opportunity right now to gather as a global community to truly try to understand the deep sea and how it is actually benefiting all of us today, and what we need to do in order to ensure that it continues to provide benefits tomorrow. Thanks.
Thank you. And I think Matt is the only one who hasn't had a final word.
Yeah, right. Well, just to say that throughout the 1980s, the nations of the world gathered together to negotiate regulations to open up Antarctica to mining. And in the end, enlightened leadership convinced them otherwise, and they established a 50-year moratorium on any mining in Antarctica. They can do it again today with the deep ocean. This is a global commons. It's regulated by a global body, and it would really be a signal of hope to humankind as a whole if the collective leadership of the world were together and say, our forebears thought this was a good idea in the 1970s when they negotiated this regime, but now it's 2022. We know better. Let's not do this. It's possible, and it can be done.
Thanks again, everyone. Great panel, and final word over to Minna Epps from IUCN.
Thank you very much, Torsten. Excellent moderation there. And some really, really strong takeaway messages, final messages. So I'll let those sink in and as you digest those. I think this session has been really, really insightful, but also really showing the complexity. And obviously the IUCN Resolution is really looking at considering the unique valuable characteristics of the deep ocean and the seabed ecosystem and its intrinsic value, and that we have to protect it. And IUCN will always be promoting, precautionary principle in this regard. I do want to emphasize that IUCN is a union with very diverse membership, and this motion is now the IUCN policy. However, we're also very much aware that there are several member state agencies that actually abstain from voting. So I think that also illustrate that they are not yet in a position to make those kind of informed decisions. So I think there's also a possibility to have this, we talked about capacity building and raising that. So doing that in all respect so that different can actually make informed decisions. We will put this forward as our position at the upcoming CBD meetings. And otherwise as well. And if you are there, please do reach out. We're very happy to continue this dialogue. So we'll also be in New York for the BBNJ negotiation. So thanks for all the panelists and all the active participants who actually contributed to raising those questions. And yeah, thank you very much. So with that, I conclude this webinar and thank you very much. And for those who want to see it again, you can come back in for 3.5 hours.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.